um adendo, a Cecília, né, e Suzana, que podem já falar inglês.
Carol, já começou, já começou.
Olá, já começamos. Estávamos aqui nos bastidores com os probleminhas técnicos, mas vamos começar agora, então, essa conferência, esse debate que muito nos alegra, nos honra, uma ocasião super especial de receber aqui com a gente a socióloga, professora da Universidade de Stony Brook, Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí, that welcome with us. I'm very, very happy to welcome here with us for this talk. So, in a few minutes...
Muito obrigada por estar aqui.
Então, nós vamos começar, então, apresentando a tradução do livro A Invenção das Mulheres, que é um livro clássico muito importante para a gente, que foi publicado em 1997 e só agora está sendo traduzido no Brasil pela Bazar do Tempo. Então, é um momento histórico. Oyèrónkẹ, I'm saying we are also celebrating the translation of your book that was published in 1997, but only now is being translated in Brazil. So it's a very special occasion for us. Então, eu vou passar a palavra para a editora da Bazar do Tempo, Ana Cecília, que vai falar um pouco sobre essa tradução, já que hoje também é o lançamento do livro A Invenção das Mulheres no Brasil. Ana Cecília.
Obrigada, Tatiana. Obrigada a todas as organizadoras dessa segunda jornada de feminismos decoloniais. Estão me ouvindo?
No, I will tell you in 5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes. Okay.
Only a little bit about the book being translated, and I will give you the microphone.
Okay. So I'm taking a small break now.
Yeah. Okay. But it's just 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, 5 minutes is long.
Bom, então fico à vontade aqui para falar tudo em português. Para celebrar, eu sou Ana Cecília, editora da Bazar do Tempo. Nós estamos lançando no Brasil A Invenção das Mulheres, um livro, né, que a gente tem falado muito disso aqui na programação da jornada. Nós estamos sempre buscando cobrir na verdade, algumas lacunas bibliográficas, sobretudo nesse campo dos estudos feministas, e por isso a gente, enfim, traz com muita alegria o livro da Oyèrónkẹ, que tem a tradução do Anderson Flor do Nascimento, que é um grande professor da UNB, que tem feito um trabalho importantíssimo na divulgação dos estudos africanos, da diáspora e da própria África, num site de filosofia africana. Então, o Anderson já era um antigo estudioso da Oyèrónkẹ, como outras tantas intelectuais e outros intelectuais, como a Catiúcha, que está aqui com a gente hoje, que escreveu também o texto de orelha do livro com Rafael Ará. E o que a gente percebeu assim, na chegada do livro, o livro chegou no Clube F há pouco mais de um mês, então a gente está fazendo agora o lançamento, primeiro foram exatamente para os assinantes do clube, que a gente entendia que existia essa demanda, mas nós fomos realmente surpreendidas. E a primeira edição ela se esgotou em algumas semanas, que é uma coisa realmente surpreendente, né? De como essa
Traz
temática...
mais uma coca
para fecharem o microfone, por favor. Todo mundo, por favor, fechar o microfone. Vai, Ana.
Acho que aqui está todo mundo, acho que só a Giovana, não sei. Bom, então, por isso, é uma alegria a gente poder hoje não só estar lançando, né, aqui com a autora, com a Oyèrónkẹ, que é uma alegria imensa, mas também a gente está celebrando essa acolhida muito positiva do livro. Então, a gente teve não só essa resposta muito positiva do mercado, né, das pessoas buscando o livro, que a gente já está em uma segunda edição, né, foi rapidamente reimpressa, como também a gente teve resenhas tão positivas, a resenha da Rosane Borges na Folha de São Paulo, e isso mostra para a gente, na verdade não mostra, isso confirma essa necessidade que a gente tem de criar uma bibliografia no Brasil contra-hegemônica, se a gente pode dizer, né? Que eu acho que, nesse sentido, o trabalho da Oyèrónkẹ é um exemplar, né, de como ela trouxe uma perspectiva totalmente nova para os estudos de gênero e como o Brasil, hoje em dia, tem essa demanda por esse tipo de produção intelectual. Então, assim, num evento como esse, né, que a gente está falando exatamente de uma produção intelectual decolonial, esse livro da Oyèrónkẹ, ele, de certa forma, ele, enfim, reflete muito o que está sendo debatido aqui nesses dias. Então, acho que foi uma iniciativa maravilhosa, enfim, do Fórum de Ciência e de Cultura da UFRJ, da FAPESP, enfim, de todas as envolvidas aqui, de poderem proporcionar a presença, né, a presença virtual, mas a presença dentro do debate brasileiro, que eu acho que isso que é muito importante, né? A Oyèrónkẹ está em outras... A gente pode ver alguns debates da Oyèrónkẹ em outras instâncias, mas aqui a gente tem esse time incrível de intelectuais, mulheres brasileiras. Então, por isso, realmente é um dia de muita alegria para a gente poder conversar com a Oyèrónkẹ, com todas vocês. Então, obrigada, e realmente a gente não poderia ter um lançamento melhor.
Muito obrigada, Ana Cecília, né? Obrigada, Bazar do Tempo, por essa tradução imprescindível para o debate brasileiro. E eu queria agora passar a palavra para fazer uma saudação também para a organizadora, né? Dentro de um coletivo que organizou essa jornada de feminismos decoloniais, a professora Suzana Castro, do IFIX. Suzana.
Bom dia, desculpa aí pela confusão com a conferência da professora Oyèwùmí, que seria num outro horário, mas por circunstâncias do fuso horário a gente antecipou, então peço ao público, em nome da organização, desculpa. Eu e Caroline Marim contamos com esse público, com esse grupo maravilhoso de mulheres que nos apoiaram, né? Acho que sem elas nós não teríamos conseguido realizar esse evento com esse formato. E eu queria muito falar sobre o trabalho editorial da Bazar na figura da Ana Cecília. A gente não vê, muitas vezes, a importância desse trabalho editorial. O editor fica muitas vezes por trás, né? Há pouca visibilidade disso. Mas tem uma importância política, acadêmica enorme a escolha dos títulos que estão sendo lançados. E a editora Ana Cecília Zamperi, à frente da Bazar do Tempo, tem feito publicações que são verdadeiras delimitadores, marcos teóricos. Eu vou citar apenas alguns. Os livros da Heloísa Buarque de Holanda, organizados pela Heloísa Buarque, com apoio, inclusive, da Mary Castro, que está aqui conosco, são livros que estão trazendo o resgate de uma discussão muito importante na área de gênero. A publicação do livro da Alice Walker, que é muito importante, que traz uma temática muito importante. E agora a publicação das Obras Completas da Rita Segato, assim, uma lacuna enorme. E a Invenção das Mulheres, como a Tatiana mesmo disse, com atraso enorme, né? Então, obrigada pelo seu trabalho. Eu, como professora intelectual da área, agradeço o seu empenho. Eu sei que a gente precisa de mais editoras e editores como você. Well, I'm going to talk in English because we have the wonderful presence of Professor Oyèwùmí today with us. I hope she's listening. I don't know. I just want to say we are hoping that's just the beginning of a big bridge between us, decolonial feminists, and African scholars. We know there is a gap, there is an absence, and we want to close this gap. We had a wonderful talk yesterday with Monica Sejas. Please, the ones who didn't see the conference, please take a minute and look at it. She gave us a wonderful picture about the huge intellectual works that are in progress in Africa about feminism and about gender also. I know we are going to discuss this today. So welcome, Professor Oyèwùmí. We are very honored and pleased to have you with us.
Okay, so let's start the conference, our main conference of Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí. Your word now. The microphone. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, now.
And I can start now?
Yes, you can start
now.
Okay.
Bonjour, everybody. And I have to say good afternoon, because it's afternoon in Lagos, okay? So they didn't give me anything specifically to talk about, but I know that the conference is related to my book, The Invention of Women. So, because in my books, I have written a lot about concepts and everything. You will find the concepts, you'll find the explanations. So I thought, at least in the first part of my lecture, I'm going to do the story of the invention of women, okay? I'm going to give you a little background, some anecdotes about the book. So let me start. Since you now have a Portuguese translation of the book, The Invention of Women, I decided to start with the background story of how the book came to be, and then highlight its contribution, including to the debate on coloniality and decoloniality. In the second part of the lecture, I will spotlight my latest book, What Gender is Motherhood, and show how it deepens themes of language, translation, naming, and the depth of coloniality. I will conclude by reflecting on the meaning of decoloniality, which has become a buzzword of our time. Okay, I'm trying to get the right view. Gallery, no? I'm just seeing, okay, full screen. I'm wanting to see everybody, right? Gallery, okay. Speaker. Okay. Mainstream Western characterizations of the social world tend to be unilinear and universalistic in ways that arrest critical theorizing. In fact, thinking within the West about gender, social hierarchy, citizenship, democracy, and Africa, among other things, is in serious need of repair. Cultural biases tend to deny agency to many experiences, except when those experiences are filtered through Western representations. Looking at African realities without such biases uncovers different conceptions of the problematic. I began my academic journey studying political science at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. Most of our studies were focused on the state, and we read Western political theories such as Karl Marx, the social contract theories, Joseph Schumpeter, Jeremy Bentham, Niccolo Machiavelli, among others. The curriculum was based on notions of Western civilization, and the universality of its experiences was taken for granted in our studies in Nigeria. We also took a number of courses on African politics, which gave me an understanding of the important role colonization played in constituting the state in Africa. Nevertheless, when I applied to graduate school in the United States in the 1980s, I decided to go into sociology and not political science. Why? During my undergraduate career at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, I took only one sociology course, the sociology of the family, in which we studied standard Western sociological texts on the family. We learned little or nothing about African family systems. The particular sociology course, however, made a deep impression on me in relation to interest I had started to develop in the family as an institution. I had become acutely aware of the variety of family organizations in Nigerian society, having grown up in a large, affluent, more traditional African family, in sharp contrast to many of my friends whose mothers were college educated and lived in what appeared to be Western nuclear families. Having learned how much colonization had to do with changes in Africa's family forms, my interest was to study the intersection of colonization and the family. Sociology, it seemed to me, was the discipline where I could study the family. Political science had no room for that. I did not, at that time, clearly understand the public-private divide in Western thought and how it may have shaped the boundaries of different disciplines. At the time I enrolled at the University of California at Berkeley in the 1980s, I did not know that there was a new and developing area of study called gender or women's studies. Therefore, I was pleasantly surprised by the courses on offer, and I promptly registered in my first sociology of gender seminar. In my gender classes, I was shocked. That's in my US gender classes. I was shocked by the grand and grandiose claims being made about women of all societies and from all times. Claims that women are powerless, that women are subordinated, and that in every society, historically, women have been oppressed. I did not see the evidence for these claims, at least historically. They must have been based, and now I understand that they were based on an assumption that because Western societies looked a certain way, then all other societies had to be like that. What is more, because women's equality was seen as a sign of civilization, and because the Occident, that's how you say the West, right? the Occident was reputedly the most civilized region of the world. Westerners believed that no society could have been organized differently. Anthropology was the discipline that brought home to the Occidental societies the idea that gender is socially constructed, that societies organize gender categories in different ways, and that therefore gender must be understood as a social construct, not a biological one. This claim did not put any dent in universalist claims of the West. Gender as a social construction did not stop them from universalizing ideas about their society and imposing it on other people. There was no question from this point of view, from the Occidental point of view, that women existed as a category, as a subject, always already constituted and ready to be studied as subordinated and inferior to men. This was an assumption, whether you've done research or not, right? The anthropology of gender course that I took at Berkeley made this abundantly clear as we examine research that purported to claim to be studying a tribe called women. One of the most influential texts during this period was Women, Culture, and Society. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with it. An anthropological book edited by Michel Rosaldo and Louise Lamphere, in which several scholars claim that the subordination of women was universal. I was particularly intrigued by the constant claim that despite the fact that the differences between males and females were not that large, human societies used all sorts of artifice, all sorts of arrangements, like language, family organization, kinship categories, to exaggerate the differences between men and women. Let me repeat. One of the things I learned from my first courses of gender in my American university was that they said that societies all across the world exaggerate, make bigger the differences between male and female. And that was a way of reinforcing the inferiority of women, okay? This claim fascinated me because Yoruba language completely did the opposite. Yoruba language as an institution did not exaggerate the differences between men and women. Rather than perceive males and females as different, Yoruba actually presented them, at least linguistically, as the same. That's why in Yoruba, there's no word for brother, there's no word for sister, there's no word for son, there's no word for daughter, right? Which are gendered kinship category. I pointed out in my classes that Yoruba was a non-gendered language par excellence, in that there were no gendered pronouns or gendered kinship category. Yoruba people do not have a single word for son, daughter, brother, sister in their everyday vocabulary. Similarly, I said, the Yoruba categories translated into husband and wife in English were not gender specific because the two categories included people of both anatomic sexes. If anything, I explained in my classes that Yoruba kinship categories express seniority based on age rather than gender. You can ask me to elaborate this during the Q&A, okay? Most importantly, I continued, hierarchy within the family was not based on gender, but that conduct privileged the person who is older in any particular interaction at any given time. No one, it seemed, in my classes at UC Berkeley, no one in my classes seemed to want to engage with my findings. When I raised my hand in class and objected to their unwarranted universal claims and assumptions about men and women, my comments were ignored or dismissed. Subsequently, I came to understand that Africa did not count for much in the theories about the human condition. Furthermore, I became aware that Africa was regarded as the most primitive and most misogynistic continent, a view that made it difficult for some of my professors and fellow students to take seriously any comments I was making that did not fit their prejudices. As an outgrowth of this misconception about Africa, I was constantly interrogated by fellow students and sometimes by professors about why I was enrolled in sociology and not anthropology. At the University of Ibadan, as in many universities on the African continent, there were no anthropology departments because of the terrible history of anthropology as the handmaiden, enabler of colonization. I would ask my interrogators to explain the difference between anthropology and sociology. A number of fellow students would reply that the anthropologists study other societies, the other. Is it otro in Portuguese? I know in Spanish, it's otro, right? They study the other. Anthropologists study the other, and then they will tell me that sociologists study their own society. I would reply, voila, I am a sociologist because I am studying my own society. It was only much later that I understood that what they were delicately trying to say, this was Berkeley. Berkeley is supposed to be one of the most progressive places, public schools in America. So they were dancing around this. They were trying to tell me that Africa is too primitive for sociological study because the discipline of sociology was designed to account for modernity from which Africa had been excluded. That's where they were coming from. But at the time, I didn't understand it. It was only later. During this time period, I was also taking courses on the sociology of race and ethnic relations and discovering that I was Black. An identity I never thought I had until I got to the US. You can interrogate me on this, you can say it's ignorance, but many of us Africans, West Africans, we never thought of ourselves as Black until we go, oh, I'm Black, okay, So, because my graduate education was not funded by the university or any other organization, I had to spend a lot of time as a teaching assistant to pay for my education and living expenses. Because teaching assistantships were coveted and valuable and scarce within my department, the number of times you could be a teaching assistant was very limited. I had to go outside of the department and look for jobs wherever I could find them on campus. Because I came into the country as a foreign student, I was not allowed to seek employment off campus. One department that repeatedly supported me with teaching assistantship and made it possible for me to complete my education was the Department of African American Studies. Because at the time, they had no in-house graduate students of their own. They were able to recruit teaching assistants from other departments. This development was an untold blessing for me because through the many courses on African American experience, I got a full education on the United States history, culture, politics, sociology, and as a result, I became an Americanist. In addition, I chose race as one of my areas of concentration, integrating it with my studies on European colonization of Africa. The other two fields in which I took a pre-dissertation qualifying exam were gender and development. By the time I chose a dissertation topic, it was clear to me that I had to move away from development because I felt that the emerging field of women in development had already produced African women as the beast of burden that had to be liberated by Western women. I used to insist that I wanted to understand Africa, but not develop her. My reaction against this representation of African women was so strong that the first chapter of my dissertation was titled The White Woman's Burden. And that chapter was published. I'm sure you can find it, okay? The more familiar I became with writings of African American feminists, the more problematic was the idea emanating from white feminism that all women were the same and equally oppressed. In fact, I came to realize that the theories and concepts discussed in my sociology classes came out of the European and American experiences, not American experiences, and were based on the assumption about society and human condition that may or may not have anything to do with Africa. For me, then, it became clear that with every concept and theory I came across, I had to understand its underlying assumptions and interrogate its claims in relation to African societies. Ultimately, I chose a dissertation topic that allowed me to try to make sense of Western claims about gender first, and about women and the intersections of it with history, culture, religion, politics, and using the research data I was gathering on Yoruba society. I must have put together a coherent research proposal because I got funding and I was able to go to Ibadan in Nigeria to conduct research. Once there, I came to understand my research project as an effort to document why and how gender came to be constructed in Yoruba society, and how gender is constituted as a fundamental category. The major question I addressed in Invention, at least the way I saw it at the time, was this: what are the relationships among bioanatomical distinctions and gender differences as part of social reality on the one hand, and on the other, gender constructs as something the observer brings to the situation? The day I understood that I had to start my research with the question, what is gender? Thereby interrogating its taken for grantedness, and realized its supreme importance in Western organization and thinking, was the day that my research got on the right track. And let me say something. When I landed in Ibadan to do my field work, I hired a number of research assistants, and I thought that what I was going to do was going to find research subjects going to the market. You've heard about Yoruba market as being dominated by women. I said, I'll start at the market. I'll go to those women and do a survey. And in the process of doing the survey, I'm going to ask them questions about their family organization. I'm going to ask them how many children they had, how many sons, how many daughters, and how did they organize for their children to help them in the house. I thought that by doing things that way, I'll be able to have a sense of gender, right? So I put together this survey, series of questions. And the first morning I was going to do that research, I looked at my questionnaire. My questionnaire was in English. And it's like, what? Why is my questionnaire in English? I'm Yoruba, I speak Yoruba, and I'm going to be talking to Yoruba subjects. And I'm writing a questionnaire in English. That was the first point that I knew that I had a problem. Number two, some of the questions I was asking in the questionnaire is something like, so how many children do you have? How many boys? How many girls? Then it dawned on me that there are no sons, no daughters, no boys, no girls in Yoruba language. So if I'm going to be asking them those questions, those were already leading questions, imposing gender. That was when it dawned on me. I realized that my study went beyond the empirical. It was epistemological. And so it really shifted, and it opened my eyes to a lot of things. Okay? This realization is important because much of the literature, the realization that my research had to start with the question of what is gender is an important one, because too many African scholars still on the subject of gender do not begin to understand the meaning of gender. They do not begin to understand its depth and its reach in Western thinking, because they just assume our societies are exactly like Western societies. They have adopted the Western universal without looking at their own. I call this is what I call a misrecognition of what gender is. Many African scholars assume that Western predilections wrapped up in theoretical and conceptual language and absorb them into the community and situations under study without question. I also see, especially today, what I call the cultivation of ignorance about gender, especially by African male scholars. For example, when a Yoruba scholar translates Orisha as God and goddesses, we have a problem. Yoruba did not make gender distinction amongst Oshun or Shango. They are both Orisha, okay? Thus, in the first chapter of The Invention of Women, I deconstructed the meaning of gender in Western society, asserting that it is tied up with biological determinism, the idea of the body as the foundation of social hierarchy. The two following quotes, which I cited in the book, captures the meaning of the biology of the human body in Western societies. Sociologist Dorothy Smith said, and I quote, "A man's body gives credibility to his utterance, whereas a woman's body takes it away from hers." End of quote. Another sociologist, Judith Loban, noted the ubiquity, the pervasiveness of notions of biology in the social realm in Western society. And then she said, and I quote, "Gender is so pervasive in Western society, we assume it is bred into our genes," end of quote. Given the evidence I was finding, I could not make the same claim of Yoruba society. I did not think that their statements were true of Yoruba society, at least historically. The question that arises from this finding is this: on what basis are Western categories exportable or transferable to other cultures that have a different cultural logic? It was clear to me that colonization, responses to the onslaught and its legacies were implicated in how African societies came to develop gender categories and organize institutions that look similar to Western ones. So colonization was central to the study. My work, Invention, addressed a number of debates, and I'll focus on just one in this section. One of them being on the impact of colonization on Africa. Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, early in the 60s, had developed the notion of neo-colonialism as a way of explaining to Africans that despite the fact that some African countries were getting their independence, they were still under the control of the West. He had developed the concept of neocolonialism, which was applied most directly to the economy. But then a debate developed in African studies, and they were debating about how deep is the impact of European colonization on Africans. One group of scholars, let me call them minimizers, had argued that colonization, European colonization on Africa was merely an episode, that it wasn't that important, that its legacy was not that deep. Then there were other scholars, and I think you must know about Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And the Walter Rodneys were saying that colonization, the impact was colonization was so deep and wide that we're still feeling the reverberations. For these scholars, whom I call the maximizers, colonization was not episodic, but epochal. Given Africa's loss of sovereignty and its continuing legacies even today, in a sense, I see the study documented in the Invention of Women as responding to this debate. The finding that Yoruba society did not exhibit gender in its social thinking and organization until it was colonized by the British underscored the fact that colonization had introduced gender as a new way of thinking and organizing that has had profound effect on all of the Yoruba institutions. The colonial process also created new institutions, most notably the state, with all its apparatuses of power, male superiority, and unequal distribution of resources. As a result, I declared that gender was a colonial category. I was the first to say that gender is a colonial category. That is my most important finding. In the era of decoloniality, which is now, where coloniality and decoloniality has become a trend, it has become an article of faith to acknowledge the coloniality of gender. Yet we must give credit to the scholars like me who articulated that fact decades ago. In the next section, I want to dwell a little on the coloniality of power and its implications for Africa. I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with that concept of coloniality of power that was developed by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, who coined the term coloniality of power and used it to conceptualize the origin of race in modernity. He tells us that as a result of the genocide and slavery, a white supremacist racial narrative accompanied European domination. This racial narrative of Western domination is often characterized, is often named the rise of the West narrative. And that narrative, that story seeks to justify the unequal and unjust global world in which we live today. Parallel to the rise of the West narrative is what I call a degradation of African narrative. What the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie calls the single story. So as we talk about the rise of the West and the superiority of the West, part of the way in which they ground that narrative is to have this other narrative of Africa as the other. Africa as a place where the West is not, and the degradation of Africa and the degrading of Africa actually proves Western superiority. Okay? Whether Africa is doing this or not doesn't matter. The narrative was created to justify Western racial dominance. Okay? Despite the fact that the coloniality of power was developed from the Americas, my interest in the concept as an African scholar is to highlight the importance of what went on in the Americas to the fate and well-being of Africans on the continent. All too often, the modern history of Africans and the history of modernity from an African vantage point is recounted as if it started with the Berlin Conference of 1884. Look at 1492. Look at 1884. almost 400 years, right? Good. I engage with the concept of coloniality of power in an attempt to give historical depth to Africa's multi-layered experience of colonial domination and its consequences. It should be understood by the time Europeans re-emerge. Remember, they had come to Africa during the period of the captive trade to kidnap and sell Africans. And then they came back in the 19th century. So I am arguing by the time Europeans re-emerged on the African shores in the 19th century, the Europeans had benefited from the largesse that African enslavement enabled. Most importantly, by the 19th century, Europeans understood themselves to be a different species of humans than the rest, but their self-perception was also different from what they had been a few centuries earlier. I am arguing that in 1492, Europeans were not conscious of themselves as Europeans. The category didn't exist. Indeed, Annibal Chiano talks about the new category, number one, that they hadn't developed that sense of superiority. So we must understand that it was in the process of genocide, enslavement, and exploitation of other people that their new identity developed as superior. And then they interpreted it as genetic and inherent. In 1492, that wasn't there. But by 1884, when they came back to Africa to occupy the land, their consciousness as a separate category, a separate species, was there. Okay? So I am arguing, Europeans understood themselves to be a different species of humans than the rest, and their self-perception was also different from what they had been a few centuries earlier, because they had been transformed by the experiences of African enslavement, by the experiences of conquest and the genocide, and the new racial gender system of modernity that they had put in place. They had indeed become Europeans and Eurocentric, which, among other things, is an epistemic idea. I am saying the European of the Berlin Conference was already post-colonial, having passed through colonialism, perfect coloniality, and benefited from the colonization and domination of other groups around the world. Consequently, I want to point out that the idea of late colonialism, I don't know whether you've heard it before, but you'll see some very popular books on Africa in which there's a title of late colonialism. They call Africa's colonialism in the 19th century late colonialism in relation to the colonization of the Americas, to the colonization of South Asia and East Asia. The concept of late colonialism gives the impression that the process of colonization has several processes, and most significantly suggests Africa's isolation from global capitalism, to which she had dearly contributed way before 1884. Recall that when Columbus washed up on the island of Hispaniola in 1492, he had a number of Africans with him already. I am also saying that the ways in which enslaved Africans were treated in the Americas constituted part of our history on the continent, because it produced a fattened Europe that was eager, ready, and resourced to exploit and harvest from a degraded African identity. White supremacy is the current context under which we study, we live, and we meet. In the third part, I will focus on my recent book, What Gender is Motherhood, which deepens the themes of the invention of women, especially the importance of language, the importance of translation, the importance of naming. I do this through a focus on an endogenous knowledge system called IFA. I'm sure many Brazilians are familiar with IFA. But what is IFA? IFA is a system of knowledge that was transmitted orally originally. Structured into the institution are a set of procedures that facilitate the retrieval of information through divination. This knowledge is made accessible through divination, which generates stories, myths, narrative that profess to be God-sent. The Nigerian literary scholar defines IFA as such, and I quote, he said, IFA narratives claim divine origins and expressly assert the authority to make proclamations regarding the essential being of every object and idea from the beginning of time and extending into the limitless future. One notable institution that has had an immediate relevance for our discussion of this indigenous knowledge system is the English language. So even though it's an endogenous knowledge system, it's an indigenous knowledge system, the English language has a great impact on it. Under British colonization, English was imposed as the official language of most Yorùbá people in Nigeria, and this has remained so ever since. Thus, despite the fact that the original language of IFA is Yorùbá, much of the scholarship has been conducted in English, essentially through translation. This fact of constantly translating from Yorùbá into the English language, coupled with the reality that the primary audience of such writings is an English-speaking one, has had enormous consequences for how IFA is written, how IFA is interpreted, and for the type of knowledge generated. A basic contradiction apparent in these translations is that English, the target language, is a gendered language in which the male category is privileged. And Yorùbá, the source language, is a seniority-based one in which social categories did not indicate the type of anatomy, as I have been saying. To illustrate this significant point, I have said a number of times, the gender categories do not exist in Yorùbá. This significant point is lost on many translators of Yorùbá who inadvertently or maybe consciously introduce gender into social life and erase indigenous values, even merely through translation. The point is easily demonstrated with the imposition of the English gendered pronoun. Usually when people are writing Yorùbá myths or telling stories in Yorùbá, they can start with a name. Let's say they start with my name. Let's say they start with Ronke. They'll say, in this story, Oyèrónkẹ did this, Oyèrónkẹ did that. And then in the next sentence, they'll say, he did this, right? They introduce the he pronoun, even though Oyèrónkẹ is not a he, right? So just merely by translation, a lot of things written in Yorùbá now have a cast of male dominance and erases female and female agency. Let me now talk very specifically about the category that is central in IFA, and I chose this because I know that there are many Brazilians who are also IFA devotees, right? So the first person, scholar, we are told, who documented aspects of IFA, I want to say for an English-speaking audience, was the anthropologist William Bascom. he did his research in the 1930s, and he established without any discussion that Ifa divination is a male exclusive province. How did he arrive at that? It was an assumption, I want to say, that was also aided by mistranslation. Diviners are called Babalawo. The word Baba in Yoruba is usually translated as father. A close reading of Bascom's analysis of the nature of Ifa priesthood suggests that Bascom's summation that only males can be diviners may have been based on information gathered not from a native informant, but by his own linguistic analysis. So he translated Babalawo into father has secrets or father of the secret. By translating the word Baba or Baba as father, he assumes gendered meaning where it is not necessarily the case. The crucial translation of Baba into father in this instance is erroneous because despite the fact that Baba is an equivalent of the English father or the French père, it is also a word that means mastery, expertise, or leadership. Thus, the Baba in Babalawo is the equivalent of the English expert in Awo, not father of Awo, okay? The Baba in Babalawo alludes to the expertise or mastery of the Ifa corpus that Babalawo must attain before they are admitted into the order of Ifa diviners. Consequently, the word Babalawo is not gendered male, and in actuality, the term is used to refer to both male and female diviners, all of whom have gone through the rigorous and lengthy training to become Ifa diviner. Babalawo is a mark of intellectual distinction and not a mark of gender division. Perhaps it is also important to point out that the term Iya, often translated as mother, and Baba translated as father in Yoruba usage do not always attach to the anatomy. Thus, one may refer to any male or female relative of one's mother as mother because they are seen as representing the mother's side of the family. So my uncle from my mother's side, I could introduce that uncle to Mary Castro and say, Mary, meet my mother. Okay? We do that in Yoruba. You can also do the same with your father's sister and introduce her as your father, right? The emphasis is that they are representing that side of your family because those things mean different things, okay? And it is not only in Yoruba society that this happens. There are a lot of things that go on in other African societies. And indeed, in the book, I quote a Burkinabe shaman, a shaman that is from the country of Burkina Faso, Malidoma Some. He has quite a number of books. And he talks about his culture, which is Dagara culture, and he talks about a category that is similar. And let me quote him at some length. And this is the shaman speaking, and I quote. He said, I learned later that Nyagoli was my male mother's son. So they have a category called male mother in his culture. That is the son of my mother's brother, my uncle. It is as though the father must at some point efface himself for the son to survive. And this is when the male mother becomes useful. The feminine in the male, the mother in the man, is an energy that can be triggered into wakefulness only by a male directly associated with the mother. The male mother is therefore thought of as someone who carries water, the energy of peace, quiet, and reconciliation. End of quote. Although in the Dagara example, the shaman cast this relationship in gender terms, what I want to draw attention to is the fact that these African kinship categories, whether in Yoruba culture or in Dagara culture, are collectively derived and are not constructed as individual identity. That is so important. And let me say that is so important because I don't know whether in Brazil this is also going on, but in the US and in many other Western societies, there are now members of LGBTQ groups, transgender people, who are now choosing their own pronouns, right? And sometimes they want me to speak to it because sometimes they think that choosing their own pronouns is related to some of what some of us in African societies have documented. But what I immediately point out to them, and I'm not saying people can't choose their own pronouns, but what I want to point out is that these African family relationships is based on the collective. It's not the individual. An individual cannot choose their pronoun just based on the African thing. Maybe now you can, but I'm saying that it doesn't derive from this African thing. Because the reason why there are no words for brother, sister, and the like is that these African categories are relational and they're based on the family. So if I bring my uncle here and introduce my uncle to Mary Castro and say, this is my mother, it's not about his individual anatomy. It's a different thing altogether. And I think it's important to understand that African categories are always communal and collective. At least that was what our languages showed, okay? So I am also suggesting that the invisibility of females, because people will tell you, yeah, but we never see female babalawo. Oh, they never existed. Oh, we only saw one, right? So I am suggesting that the invisibility of female babalawo amongst the ranks of babalawo is one of the consequences and impact of Christianity, Islam, and Western culture, and other changes that have taken place in African societies. A number of European observers, for example, there was one Bernard Morpol in the 19th century who also considered Babalawo a male cult, but did point out that he met female Babalawo. His only problem is that they were too few. As a result, it seemed justified to him, based on the statistical evidence of the paucity of female Babalawo, that this is proof positive of a male exclusive cult, and that any identifiable female Babalawo is an exception that proves the rule. In my discussion of what I call statistical gendering, I expose a number of scholarly assumptions that lead to erroneous conclusions about gender in Yoruba society. In this instance, the making of the categories female Babalawo and male Babalawo already presupposes a worldview and a social landscape in which gender divisions exist. So they don't even need any evidence. They already assumed it. The statistic then only validates that biased worldview. In other words, it is not the statistic that constitutes evidence of gender distinctions. It is the gendered lens that is brought to the situation by the researcher that produces the statistic. It is not an empirical question. It is an epistemological question relating to world sense and what the social categories of knowledge are in the particular society. In the Yoruba world, in which the categories male and female were not divisions involving social valuation, such a statistic would be meaningless. This is not an argument about numbers, but one about how information is organized and understood. Thus, beyond what the anthropologists saw or did not see, we have to pay attention to other factors that explain the male privileging. Perhaps another reason why Ifa was seen as a male-dominant realm was that Babalawo are important and respected in the culture. And given where Europeans were coming from, in which women are subordinated, they were not considered as knowledgeable and the like, they could not accept that in an African society, that Babalawo, one of the most important knowledge categories, also included women. And indeed, one sociologist, John Peel, anybody who studies Yoruba society must know about John Peel, pointed out that in 19th century Yoruba land, there were Christian pastors, Yorubas who had been converted, and there were Muslim clerics. And whether it was a Christian pastor or the Muslim cleric, these categories were exclusively male. So people, the newly converted and the European missionaries could not entertain that the Yoruba category of endogenous knowledge system included females. How many minutes do I have? Because I'm close to conclusion. Okay.
You have 10 minutes. Is that okay?
Oh, okay.
10 minutes, yeah. It's fine?
10 minutes is fine because I'm close to my conclusion.
Fine. Great.
Okay. From what I have been saying, you can see that the need to decolonize knowledge at all levels today cannot be overstated. The detailed kind of work that I am doing is necessary in order to identify the different nodes and multi-layered understanding of what needs to be done in order to decolonize. We're all talking about decolonize. It's a lot of work, but we have to understand what it means first. What does decolonial mean? I said for a start, we have to be alert and informed about African sources of knowledge and the power interests involved in how we come to interpret and to rememorize it. The great South African intellectual and anti-apartheid activist, Archie Mafeja, asked the question, and I quote, "What forms of accumulated knowledge do Africans have, and how do we get at it?" End of quote. What forms of accumulated knowledge do Africans have, and how do we get at it? And I say that this was a radical question. As simple as it is, it was a radical question. And in many places, it's still a radical question because people don't think that Africans have any knowledge or accumulated knowledge, right? So that's partly why I have focused on IFA, an endogenous system of knowledge. My own research have always taken this kind of question as its starting point, and the studies have done, apart from exposing colonization, is also to expose African sources of knowledge. So the need to decolonize is absolutely necessary. We cannot exaggerate it. What does decolonize mean? I said to decolonize is to indigenize, is to endogenize. Although we are all fixated on the word decolonial, we must not forget that to decolonize can only be a transitional phase in our quest for freedom and sovereignty. Decolonial cannot be an end in itself. That's what I'm saying. It can only be a transitional phase, okay? The renowned Ghanaian linguist, Professor Kwesi Pra, writes, and I quote, "Intellectual sovereignty means a free, liberated, and self-determining agency in knowledge production, with answers firstly to societal particularities, while contributing secondarily and almost inadvertently to universal knowledge." Professor Pra is saying that for Africans, our knowledge production must be intellectually sovereign. It must be free. We must start with Africa. It must be Africa on its own terms. We must prioritize Africa. We must not be focusing on the West and other audience. We must start with ourselves and answer our own questions. If in the process, whatever our findings are, illuminates other societies or illuminate universal knowledge, that is wonderful, but that is not our priority, okay? So, for me, to decolonize knowledge is to endogenize, to indigenize, to decolonize, and to unlearn the modes of submission in all its layers. Ultimately, the goal of decolonizing is to reclaim our habits of sovereignty. Thus, the recovery of endogenous intellectual traditions is necessary as Africans seek to reclaim their sovereignty. So I said the end goal is to reclaim our habits of sovereignty. I didn't say to reclaim our sovereignty, to reclaim our habit. The word habit is important because what I am alluding to is that Africans need to be reminded that there was a time that we were making our own things, developing our own knowledges, institutions. For example, the reason why language or Yoruba language is so important was that these institutions were developed at a time when we had sovereignty. And so we need to reclaim that habit of sovereignty in a bid to claim intellectual sovereignty for our own knowledge production. I want to stop there, but let me say one thing. When the Brazilian interviewer, and I forget her name, she must be here, asked me what I would like my Brazilian audience to take from the book, The Invention of Women, I said the following, and I want to repeat it. that the Orisha unquestionably have found a home in Brazil. Thus, if my work can contribute to the knowledge of Brazilians about where the Orisha came from, about where Oshun came from, where Shango came from, where Ogun came from, I would count that as an important contribution and the beginnings of bridging the gaps between us and among us. Obrigada. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Obrigada. Thank you very, very much. We are all very touched and thrilled with your conference. We have, summing up all channels, 1,000 people watching. So it's a lot of people. With yes, we have 1,000 people watching with a lot of questions. I will give the floor to Catiúcia, but before I will just do a remark for our audience on translation. Pessoal, é o seguinte, nós sabemos que a tradução não está perfeita, né? Teve problemas, pediram para eu dizer aqui que não é IFA, que é IFA, e estou dizendo, então, que é IFA, não é IFA. Agora, olhem só, nós vamos ter um vídeo legendado. A gente não quis fazer isso agora, porque senão a gente perde a emoção de estar aqui ao vivo com até isso é isso, né? A gente tem essa dificuldade realmente de traduzir, de pronunciar. Tem pessoas aqui pedindo, inclusive, para eu pedir para a Oyèrónkẹ dizer como se pronuncia o nome dela, eu vou pedir daqui a pouco, mas eu queria deixar esse aviso muito importante. Nós vamos legendar toda essa conferência com uma tradutora profissional que conheça a filosofia da Oyèrónkẹ. Então, nós vamos ter uma boa tradução, porque essa conferência é histórica e vai ficar disponível nos nossos canais, tanto no canal do Fórum de Ciência e Cultura, quanto no canal da Jornada de Estudos Decoloniais. Ok? Então, não precisem se preocupar, porque realmente nós reconhecemos que teve problemas, faz parte, é muito difícil mesmo o tema e traduzir dessa forma, nós não podíamos ter tradução simultânea contratada, né, etc. Então, é todo um trabalho voluntário, mas nós teremos em breve, basta se inscreverem nos nossos canais e nós teremos em breve os vídeos legendados, tá bem? Então, acho que isso resolverá o problema e podem ter certeza que vai ser legendado por pessoas que tenham familiaridade com a filosofia da Oyèrónkẹ. Inclusive, nós temos aqui a Caroline Amanda e a Catiúcia Ribeiro, que vão falar daqui a pouco, que podem nos ajudar nesse sentido. Gostaria também de dar fazer mais um lembrete aqui, né? Algumas pessoas no chat lembraram que antes dessa tradução houve traduções feitas por mulheres negras, e eu estou mencionando aqui, então, essas traduções, tanto da Anin Uraci quanto Marimba Ani, são pessoas que já traduziram esses conceitos antes dessa tradução que a gente está lançando aqui hoje, então gostaria também de mencionar isso. Então, eu vou passar a palavra para a Catiúcia Ribeiro.
Só um instante, desculpa, só intervir aqui, eu só gostaria de agradecer a Bruna, que está fazendo a tradução, né? Porque, enfim, apesar dos problemas, foi feito um grande esforço, né? Foi feita também uma procura em todas as referências e tudo mais. O que acontece é que a gente vive um problema, né? Que de uma dupla tradução, ela é tradutora do inglês e não do nigeriano, e por isso esses problemas. Então, agradecer a Bruna aqui, né, por essa tradução, por todo, né, o empenho que ela teve também em fazer essa tradução. Tá? E depois nós já prevíamos isso, né, eu com ela, que haveria necessidade, né, e ela até me compartilhou comigo também essa preocupação, isso não foi um descuido nosso, né, mas na verdade a gente tem feito o possível, né, para realizar isso diante das condições que a gente tinha. Tá bom? Então, só para que, né, marcar isso, que é muito importante, né? São pessoas que estão mobilizadas e que estão se esforçando muito para que, enfim, esse evento seja maravilhoso, né? E a fala da Oyèrónkẹ foi maravilhosa, e, enfim, e a gente vai continuar fazendo o possível para, enfim, para tornar ainda melhor, né, aquilo, né, que a gente já tem feito aqui com bastante cuidado e bastante carinho. Obrigada, Bruna.
Muito obrigada, Bruna, e é isso, depois vamos aprimorar a tradução na legenda, aí temos como fazer isso com calma. Então, eu passo a palavra imediatamente para a Catiúcia Ribeiro, e que vai ser traduzida, então, pela Luana, que eu também gostaria de agradecer muito. A Luana vai traduzir do português para o inglês, e agora vai ser tradução consecutiva, gente, não vai ser mais simultânea, para que a Oyèrónkẹ possa compreender o que a Catiúcia está dizendo. Então, vai ser consecutivo. Então, Catiúcia, pedir, né, Luana, para a Catiúcia falar com pausas, para a Luana poder ir traduzindo, não é isso, Luana?
Eu ou era a Suzana? Mas eu posso...
Desculpe, a gente tinha dito que a Catiúcia seria a Suzana e a Luana seria a Carol, desculpe. Suzana, então, pode fazer da Catiúcia?
Posso.
Tá, então é Suzana.
Com a ajuda dela, vou anotar aqui.
So, we will start the intervention of Catiúcia Ribeiro, and Suzana will be translating for you, okay?
Okay, good.
So, I give the floor to Catiúcia Ribeiro.
Okay.
Bem, eu queria saudar esse dia, pedir licença aos ancestrais para que eu consiga falar, pedir bênção às minhas mais velhas, dar bênção aos meus mais novos. Eu sou omorixá no Brasil, sou uma mulher nascida e criada dentro das espiritualidades de matriz africana. E sempre quando eu falo, eu sempre peço licença, ainda mais depois de estar totalmente atravessada por Oyèrónkẹ e dizer que é uma honra para mim ouvir a senhora.
Vou tentar traduzir, você vai ouvindo e ver se dá conta, né? She wants first to salute you and say that she wants to first ask for the blessing from the orishas. She's herself devotee to the orishas, and she wants to ask for the blessing from her ancestors. She's very touched by your talk and just this introduction words first.
Okay. Thank you.
Benção. Quero dizer que eu queria abrir trazendo uma questão muito importante, que a chegada da tradução do livro da professora Oyèrónkẹ no país é muito significativo para nós, mulheres pretas, que há algum tempo estamos nos debruçando no debate que é totalmente descentralizado desse lugar do gênero.
She wants to open by mentioning the importance of the arriving of this translation in Portuguese for your book. It's a very important step in the decentralization of the quest of women in Brazil.
E também quero dizer que essa tradução, eu queria ressaltar e agradecer às mulheres pretas e aos homens pretos que, a priori, nos trouxeram os primeiros estudos de Oyèrónkẹ, e que esse estudo não chega para nós somente com a tradução desse livro. Ele não é um acontecimento de agora, ele é um acontecimento de uma tradução que vem sendo feita de forma coletiva, política, ancestral, com outras mulheres pretas e com outros homens pretos. Isso precisa ser muito bem dito, né? Porque parece que a Oyèrónkẹ chega agora e que esses esforços anteriormente não tinham acontecido.
She needs to emphasize that your translation is the result of many black women and black men in Brazil who are dealing with your work and translating it from many years already. It's not a new beginning. It's already in Brazil, and it has been used by many black and women and black men in Brazil.
Yes.
Quero começar dizendo a frase que a professora Oyèrónkẹ finaliza, dizendo que o orixá encontrou a sua casa no Brasil. O reconhecimento da casa do orixá no Brasil é o solo seguro que nós, mulheres pretas, temos para nos perceber e nos reconfigurar fora das categorias ocidentais e fora desse traço colonial, entendendo que o nosso campo de reconhecimento na história, ele rompe as correntes da colonização e está numa perspectiva que está na antiguidade africana, não atravessado pelas premissas ocidentais.
Bom, she wants to make reference to the end phrase of your talk when you say that the Orisha found a home in Brazil. For her, this is a special statement. For a Black woman in Brazil who finds in this soul of the Orisha their strength to continue to struggle against coloniality and the gender categories and so on.
Nesse sentido, eu, no Brasil, sou do programa de pós-graduação que está aqui, no programa de Suzano, no programa de Carol, e há algum tempo me debrucei a fazer uma investigação epistemológica no que as filosofias produzidas no continente africano poderiam nos trazer como uma premissa de reconstrução e reontologização desse corpo, desse sujeito que está totalmente configurado pelo Ocidente.
In this sense, she's a graduate student of philosophy. She's at the same program where I teach and where Caroline is also a student. And she is studying with, she's studying a lot, and she wants to find in African antiquity and African philosophies works which will give her others ontologies to rebuild the woman conception in Brazil.
O trabalho da professora Oyèrónkẹ, né, da minha mais velha, eu que sou uma mulher de axé, então vou sempre me reportar a ela como uma mais velha, né, entendendo esse lugar de que veio antes e traz uma sabedoria para nós. Esse trabalho, ele tem esse texto, essa sabedoria, essa pulsão ancestral que é narrada pela fala e atravessada pela nossa cosmosensação, pela nossa cosmopercepção, ela reintegra a África no lugar de soberania destruída pelos processos coloniais e que coloca e centralizada na supremacia branca, uma supremacia ocidental.
You are muted.
You're muted.
Sorry.
Okay.
She wants first to address to you as her older sister, because she's also a Orisha woman from, and your talk is a talk where she can feel the ancestor vibration, and it is crossed with the cosmovision of the ancestors, and this cosmovision is very important to reintegrate, to rebuild this relationship between Africa and Brazil. this cosmo perception and this cosmo vision, it cross your talk.
Preservando aos povos africanos um olhar sobre si que é sempre ancorado no outro. O que nós conhecemos da nossa história, o que nós conhecemos da nossa perspectiva enquanto feminilidade, o que nós conhecemos até enquanto essa categoria mulher, como a professora Oyèrónkẹ nos traz, é sempre a partir de um traço e sempre a partir de um olhar do que o Ocidente fez de nós, né? Nós nunca tivemos a possibilidade de olhar para as nossas narrativas, olhar para as nossas possibilidades de configuração do mundo, sem que o Ocidente seja aquele que alicerça a forma como nós nos percebemos no mundo.
She continues, I missed one important point. She's talking about the way this white supremacy has blocked the possibility of a black woman or woman of color in Brazil. She said black woman first, and to have an own perception of her own lives. It's always interrupted, it's always interconnected with Western categories and Western narratives. And your work gives a very special possibility to reintegrate with the oranges, with the African oranges.
A professora Oyèrónkẹ sinaliza no livro que eu tive a honra de escrever a orelha desse livro junto com o meu colega, meu irmão de travessia, Rafael, que esse processo é um processo histórico, é um processo cultural e também é um processo filosófico. E sendo um processo filosófico, automaticamente tem essa construção cartesiana centrada no Ocidente e como esse pensamento determina todas as relações no mundo. Como esse pensamento determina todas as possibilidades de construção de pensamento. Logo, o modelo do mundo, esse modelo de mundo, né, que é um modelo de mundo que só vê e só compreende o Ocidente como a possibilidade de construção de sujeito, de cultura e de relações sociais.
She's talk about the book, The Invention of Woman. She wrote the second cover, and she's very pleased to have written it with another person, Rafael. They wrote together, and she wants to signalize how important it is the turnover of the Cartesian conception that you wrote about, this perception of the world where only the Western civilized persons are subject, only them. And that's a very important contribution you made to philosophy.
Perfect.
Thank you. I haven't received the book, the Brazilian translation.
We have to talk to the editors. Yeah, we have to send to you
good.
immediately. We are doing this
so that I can see.
Yeah.
I love the cover though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ela disse que não recebeu o livro ainda, infelizmente, mas que ela quer ter o livro e que ela adorou a capa. Ela achou linda a capa, muito bonita a capa. Ela quer ver o livro.
E, de fato, eu quero dizer para as pessoas que estão nos assistindo, gente, para ler esse livro, porque esse livro ele é fundamental, ele dá um bug na nossa cabeça e nos dá a possibilidade de pensar o mundo num outro lugar. E aí, nesse sentido, para ir avançando, para não me estender muito, Suzana, quando a professora Oyèrónkẹ traz para nós, né, que nesse modelo ocidental, nesse modelo de cultura, nesse modelo de história, que não pode ser um modelo ele não pode ser universal, né? E aí eu gosto muito de uma premissa que o professor e filósofo Mongobi Ramosi nos traz, que esse universal ele advém do latim, de unius, uma única possibilidade de pensar o mundo. E nessa única possibilidade, somente o Ocidente é quem determina a nossa forma de ser e estar no mundo. Por isso que destitui dos seres africanos o lugar de humanidade, colocando nesse lugar de não humanidade. Logo, não considera a África como produtora de conhecimento e construção de humanidade.
She talk about the importance of your book in relation also with the philosopher Hamosi, who wrote about the universalism as this conception of the uno from Latin uno, and which suffocate the possibilities of the pluriversal ideas and universal. The universalism is a conception which block the multi-perspectives.
Yes.
Então, a professora Oyèrónkẹ, ela nos apresenta a possibilidade de pensar a partir de nós, né? E eu sempre pergunto, né, quando nós estamos pensando essas categorias, pensando no lugar das mulheres, e quando a professora Oyèrónkẹ fala, inclusive, que a mulher é uma invenção do Ocidente e que ela chega na Urubalândia com os adventos da colonização, em especial a colonização britânica, demonstra o quanto nós precisamos olhar para essa África da antiguidade. E eu olho para o trabalho da professora Oyèrónkẹ como um trabalho de filosofia antiga, o estudo da antiguidade, e buscar nessa antiguidade uma possibilidade de nos reconstruir fora desse eixo que é atravessado pelo Ocidente. Porque na medida que nós ficamos pensando dentro desse eixo do Ocidente, nós ainda estamos no epicentro ocidental, o que não nos ajuda a nos perceber enquanto pessoas africanas na África global.
Well, she's saying that your work, it's very important for those of us which want to think about themselves, about ourselves, up to ourselves, not to up to what others think about us. And she thinks about your work as and she uses it at the antique philosophy, because the word you describe in Yorùbá land is it's reconstitution of this knowledge, which were for a long time not allowed us to have contact with. But at the same time, this knowledge is a knowledge which will allow us to free ourselves from this Western thinking, which are silencing our thinking about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Tem algum tempo que eu não busco mais no Ocidente, né, possibilidade de perspectiva de mundo, né? Eu não sou feminista, justamente por compreender, como a senhora traz, que nós precisamos olhar para o continente africano, fazer uma investigação epistemológica no continente africano e buscar nessa investigação epistemológica uma possibilidade de nos perceber. A senhora trouxe algo que para mim foi muito me bateu, como diz aqui no Brasil, me bateu muito grande. Eu sou uma mulher raspada para Ogum no Brasil, né? Tenho 40 anos de vivência espiritual. E quando a senhora traz que Ogum não tem gênero, eu penso na minha relação com esse ancestral, penso na minha relação com esse orixá, que nunca foi uma relação de hierarquia e de soberania, mas uma relação de complemento, e esse complemento que dá a pulsão da vida no continente africano. Então, olhar para essa experiência nos ajuda a pensar como nós vamos nos reconfigurar enquanto povo, a partir da nossa própria perspectiva e como a senhora traz, a partir da nossa própria agência.
She considers herself not as a feminist. She thinks that the Western thinking, it's not where she wants to start her perception. And she thinks it's necessary to research African epistemologies, which give us other possibilities to perceive ourselves. She has her head, her ori, made by Ogum, and she was very touched by when you talk that Ogum has no gender. Because it's how she wants to express her relation to Ogum. It has to be with other perceptions, and you gave her this possibility during your talk. Thank you.
Olhar para esse modelo de mundo, olhar para a África, nos faz nos perguntar como nós podemos olhar para o que éramos, olhar para as nossas ancestrais. Aqui no Brasil, o movimento feminista ele é um movimento muito forte e que tem um percurso construído por grandiosas mulheres. E, há algum tempo, algumas mulheres começaram a tentar pensar o mundo fora dessa perspectiva ocidental, generificada, feminista, porque não dá conta de nós. E quando a senhora traz isso no seu livro, a senhora nos reintegra num lugar de compreensão que não é de ataque do outro, tampouco dizer que as mulheres negras que estão ainda alicerçadas nesses conceitos estão contra a sua raça. Pelo contrário, o que nós estamos tentando compreender é como olhar para o que a senhora escreve, olhar para as nossas ações e olhar para nós, né? Porque nós compreendemos que nós somos mulheres africanas em diáspora, em dispersão, né? Que o tráfico transatlântico não tira de nós esse pertencimento, porque é um pertencimento ancestral. Então, problematizar a questão de gênero para tentar entender como as nossas categorias elas são construídas, sobretudo na senioridade, é fundamental para entender como o nosso corpo ele está presente para as nossas ações políticas.
She mentions the fact that Brazilian feminism is very strong, and your work is giving now the possibility that this feminism in Brazil start looking at other possibilities to think about gender and feminism, or with or without gender, but it's another possibility, because there is this other way to see the world. You were presenting a view which is also very strong based on the ancestors. And she says that although we are all Brazilian, are Afro-diasporic women, there is this, and despite of the slave trade, there is this strong connection between Brazilian women, Afro-Brazilian women, and Africa and African roots, and that's how she's seeing the importance of your work, to see ourselves by our own conceptions, not through gender or categories, others' categories.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Para finalizar...
Obrigada.
Ai, eu fico emocionada. Para finalizar, eu queria dizer para a senhora que quando nós trazemos essa narrativa, nós, mulheres, estamos pensando qual é o lugar da mulher africana na história, e não é esse lugar, né? Ancorado no Ocidente, muitas das vezes diz que nós mulheres queremos colocar o mundo nas costas das mulheres negras. Na verdade, a gente não quer colocar o mundo nas costas das mulheres negras, é tirar esse mundo ocidental das costas das mulheres negras e perceber que existe um outro caminho para nós, né? E esse caminho não é focar no Ocidente, não é focar no gênero, não é ficar focado nas perspectivas ocidentais que não dão conta da grandiosidade que é ser uma mulher preta numa comunidade.
She talks about the way this other narratives gives another way to answer the question, what is the place of women? Which are the places of women? And when this other vision comes in place, she wants to say she's not putting the word in the back of the Black woman, but she wants to show that the Western perspective, Western views are not enough, are not sufficient to show the importance and all the relevance of Black women. And it's not enough. It's waste.
Inadequate.
Yeah.
I get it. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna.
So we have to have the other speaker, and we have to have questions from the audience, you know.
Yeah. Yes, I'm worried about that. No, but wait.
It's more than 10 minutes.
Oyèrónkẹ, I think you are a little bit tired, perhaps, no?
I'm what?
Are you tired, I think?
No. But
okay.
I also want the audience. I also want questions from the audience too.
Great. So we will listen. Okay.
It's 4 o'clock already. When do we end?
It depends on you. It depends. Can you stay with us more, half an hour? You think it's okay? 30 minutes?
Half an hour latest, right?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So it will be my 4:30.
Okay.
Right?
So I give the floor to Carol Amanda, and then I take some questions from the audience, and we have still for 30 minutes.
Yeah,
okay?
If we have time, okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Katusha Ribeiro. You've said a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Axé. Thank you.
So,
oh my God. Vocês me ouvem bem? Eu peço licença, a bênção para chegar. Mais velha. Luana, você está traduzindo para ela?
Você quer que eu espere você terminar de falar para eu poder traduzir?
Eu preparei uma frase para me apresentar para a senhora em Yorùbá. Espero pronunciar bem.
She has learned a sentence in Yorùbá.
Iauá é pé. Fum. Uau. Eu vou ler novamente. Iauá é pé. Fum. Uau. Nossa anciã, que a sua essência dure para nos guiar. Nós estamos esperando para ouvi-la há muitos séculos.
She really appreciates, and she asks for your blessing, and she says we have been waiting to listen from you for a long time, for centuries actually, from what you have said.
A primeira vez que eu li a senhora foi pela tradução dos irmãos do Recôncavo da Bahia, uma tradução que falava sobre corpo e corporalidade.
She says the first time she heard of you was when two brothers from Bahia, here in Brazil, they translated a text where you talked about body, embodiment, and corporality.
E na mesma semana eu acessei um outro texto que é onde a senhora conta a sua jornada na academia.
That same week, she was after a text where you talk about your journey in the academy.
A Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro foi a última universidade a aderir às ações afirmativas.
The University from Rio de Janeiro was the last university in Brazil to use the affirmative actions to integrate.
E, por sua vez, no ano de 2013, eu ainda vivia o que a senhora viveu na década de 80.
That in 2013, she was still experiencing what you had experienced in the 80s, for example.
Então, em uma aula de sociologia, eu ouvi uma frase do Hegel.
Oh, in a sociology class, once she heard a Hegel quote.
O berço da criança é o túmulo dos pais.
That the birth of the child is the grave from their parents.
E ali eu decidi que pesquisaria famílias negras.
And that's when she decided she would research about Black families.
Eu não acredito em uma sociedade que se estrutura nessa convicção.
Can't believe in a society that is founded in this conviction, where the new to be born, the old must die, basically.
Teorias e práticas que suscitem esse tipo de raciocínio são anti-ancestralidade.
Any kind of theory that has this as basis is anti-ancestrality.
E eu tive a felicidade de encontrar a obra da senhora.
I was glad, and I had the pleasure and the happy to find your work.
Em uma conferência sobre epistemologias pan-africanas,
in a conference about Pan-Africanistic epistemology,
a senhora disse: a família é a instituição mais importante do mundo.
Said that the family is the most important structure in the world.
Imagine no continente africano.
Motherhood in the continent.
Então ali eu fui buscar a África possível em todos os quilombos que eu considero. Cada família no Brasil, cada família negra no Brasil é um quilombo.
So I started looking for that in all the quilombos because she considers, I'm doing sorry, direct translation, every Black family in Brazil as a quilombo.
Então, eu comecei a me organizar para fazer essa pesquisa no Brasil. E reencontrei com uma teórica militante negra, de Oxum também, chamada Lélia Gonzalez.
Started structuring that research, and then she found a Black researcher as well named Lélia Gonzalez, also Brazilian. Also from Oxum.
E a Lélia, assim como a senhora, me trouxe neologismos.
And both of you brought me neologism.
Ela me apresentou a categoria psicanalítica de denegação.
Oh God. She introduced me to the category of sorry, Carol, could you repeat?
Denegação. Acho que é denegation, não?
Denegation.
Então, ela me explicou que o Brasil vivia a denegação do racismo, o racismo por denegação.
And she explained that Brazil was going through the sorry, again, please, denegation of this country.
E eu pude observar essa manifestação muito forte entre as feministas.
And I could notice this was very strong among feminists.
Porque o fato de sermos enquadradas na fantasia do gênero,
because when we are put into this gender box,
faz com que elas, por muitas vezes, eclipse as assimetrias raciais e de classe.
Because this many times can make that they shadow the differences on gender, class and race.
Então, eu conheci a sororarquia.
Sororarchy.
Ok.
E quando... Oh, sorry. O que ela falou?
Sorry.
Sisterhood.
Sorry, I couldn't listen well.
Oh, okay. Go on.
No, please, could you repeat it? I would like to...
I said sisterhood, sorority.
Yes, sisterhood, yes, perfect. Yes, and it's moment... No, sorry, eu vou falar em português. E nesse momento que eu descobri a sororarquia, eu também me questionei, porque eu não me autodeclarava feminista. Pode traduzir?
So the moment that I found out about this, about sororarchy, I started thinking why I didn't self-intitulate as a feminist.
Mas, ao ler o livro A Invenção das Mulheres, eu fiquei me questionando sobre a categoria mulherismo.
But when I read The Invention of Women, I started questioning myself about womanism.
Que traz mulher e o ismo como sufixo.
That brings women and ism as a suffix for it.
Então, mais uma vez, a senhora me presenteou com o oxunismo.
One more time, you have given me a gift with Oxunism.
Oxunismo, ok.
Para mim, essas são as bases, né? Uma frase que norteia muito o meu processo de pesquisa no trabalho e na obra da senhora é quando a senhora diz: a radicalidade do feminismo é absolutamente local.
And something very important for me in your work is when you said that the radicality of feminism is local. It's basically local.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Eu quero pedir licença para falar um pouco, bem brevemente, sobre como as famílias negras são lidas pelo pensamento social brasileiro aqui no país.
Like to please be excused to talk a little bit about how Black families are seen here in Brazil, but talk briefly about this. Is it all right?
Can you say that again?
Sure. She would like to talk briefly about Black families in Brazil.
Okay.
Yes, if it's all right with the audience, right? Yes.
Perfeito. Então, um trecho da minha pesquisa que eu vou compartilhar é quando eu escrevo.
My research, I talk a little about.
Recentemente, estudiosos têm focado atenção sobre o uso da família.
Recently, many studies have talked about the use of family
como tropo e ideologia na constituição de projetos políticos.
The triple ideology on the construction of political projects.
Nos discursos acadêmicos.
Academic speeches and talks.
E na formulação de políticas supremacistas.
Supremacist politics.
Todavia, diante do cenário em que a família está no centro do debate, me parece que precisamos perguntar: de qual família estamos falando?
However, when we have a speech that has family as center, we need to question ourselves, what kind of family are these speeches talking about, this report is talking about?
Good question.
Já que as famílias negras ficaram fora do cenário e da observação dos sociólogos no Brasil desde a abolição.
As Black families have been out of the sociologists' research and view since the abolition in Brazil.
Quando citaram a família negra, citaram de maneira eugenista, machista e racista.
When Black families are mentioned on the studies, they're mostly referred in a eugenicistic, misogynist, and machist way.
Alguns nomes como Nina Rodrigues, Gilberto Freire.
Examples are, are those.
E grande sociólogo da esquerda brasileira, Florestan Fernandes.
And a famous left sociologist in Brazil, Florestan Fernandes.
Eu peço licença para ler brevemente algumas considerações do Florestan Fernandes sobre família negra no Brasil.
You briefly quote a couple of Florestan Fernandes mentioned about Black families in Brazil.
Okay.
Ele diz: o progresso implicado na busca de melhoria com a família negra não acontece.
Progress, when it comes to Black families, applied to Black families, does not happen.
Eles têm ordem sexual promíscua.
They are promiscuous.
Eles são absolutamente desregrados.
They're absolutely a mess. They have no order.
A herança social nefasta determina, então, caráter sociopático.
The social heritage is nefast and sociopathic.
Então, diante disso, e com o suporte e fôlego da senhora, enquanto teórica, além do suporte objetivo da minha orientadora, eu tenho me debruçado sobre as famílias negras no Brasil a partir da perspectiva afro-referenciada.
So, as in Brazil there are all these racist and eugenistic references, she's not using this anymore, and now she's counting on your work and others given by her mentors in university, so she can build her research over Black families.
Antes de eu me despedir,
before I go, before she
eu
goes,
quero dizer duas coisas apenas.
I'd like to say two more things.
A primeira é que a obra da senhora me fez aprender e relembrar muito mais do que aprender, porque acredito na memória do DNA ancestral.
First one is that your work made her learn, and more than learn, remember, because she believes in the memory of the ancestor DNA.
Que as IAs e o poder Agé,
and Agé power,
sobrevive rizomaticamente no Brasil.
Survives rhythmatically in Brazil. So I'm not sure about this translation, if it's correct.
As principais lutas da comunidade negra no Brasil
struggles and the main fight, reasons to fight
são
in Brazil,
encampadas por IAs.
Are, I'm sorry, Carol, what?
São encampadas por IAs.
Are like embraced by IAs.
Alguns exemplos.
Examples are
Mães de Maio,
Mothers from May,
luta contra o genocídio,
they fight against the genocide.
Mães e familiares de presos,
Mothers and older relatives of people imprisoned,
luta contra o encarceramento em massa,
who are fighting mass incarceration.
Mães de pessoas LGBTQI+,
The mothers of LGBTQ+ people.
Lutam por inclusão, diversidade e aceitação dos seus filhos.
fighting for their children's rights and inclusion.
Além das tradicionais IAs que cuidam da gente espiritualmente, psicologicamente,
as well as the traditional IAs who take care of us physically and mentally as well.
Dentro dos terreiros de candomblé.
Candomblé, I can worship places in the lack of a better term.
Por último,
candomblé. I've been to Bahia, you know.
O que ela falou?
Good.
Ela esteve na Bahia. She has been to Bahia.
Yes, very beautiful space. Very beautiful.
And I went to a candomblé.
Yes, em Bahia, e ainda tem a maior, se não a maior, uma das mais tradicionais, Irmandade da Boa Morte, que é regida por mulheres.
Bahia, there is one of the most traditional, if not the most traditional, Sisterhood of the Good Death.
Yes, I know about it.
By women.
Ok.
By women, yes.
Para mim terminar mesmo, eu quero terminar falando sobre o meu trabalho, não só aqui na academia, como mestranda em filosofia, orientada pela Tatiana Roque, parte do programa de pós-graduação em filosofia, PPGF, mas falar do meu trabalho como terapeuta. É muito importante saber que a matripotência.
And she would like to say that not only her academic work is something major in her life, but she would like to talk about her work as a therapist and about matripotency.
Saber que a matripotência é também mais do que um conceito teórico.
And know that matripotency is much more than just a theoretical concept.
É uma força metafísica.
It's a metaphysical force.
Que tem levantado mulheres.
That has not like raised, but lifted women.
E homens também.
As well as women, as men.
Porque nós aqui, no meu trabalho, Ioni das Pretas,
because on my job, Ioni das Pretas, or Black
temos
women,
feito o trabalho de trazer a importância da IA, a importância da matripotência para o reequilíbrio da comunidade negra.
We have brought the matripotency, the IA potency, to the rebalance of Black women's health.
Eu aprendi com a senhora.
I've learned you.
Que caráter não tem gênero.
That character has no gender.
E o apelé.
Yes.
Muito obrigada.
And she says thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions? No?
Yes. Mary will do a question. Mary, your question.
Dr. Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí, it's a great, great pleasure to have you with us. And we have been using your works, as my colleague Caroline said, especially the concept of matripotência is very, very important in Brazil. And I would like to ask you to elaborate more about this concept of matripotência. And I would say that I don't feel very comfortable when you talk about a materphobia, especially because I was socialized in the Western feminism. And I think that you went too tough, too hard on us.
Too hard.
With the concept of materphobia. And would like you would elaborate more about this. The other, to take the opportunity to have you here, please talk more about your ideas on if it is possible to talk about a decolonizing feminism, especially when you say that it has to be local, indigenous, endogenous, and it must have as a goal a freedom, because sometimes it's more related to communal, but not with the future in terms of a freedom. Please enlighten us.
Oh my, I don't know where to start. With matrophobia, you thought I was too harsh on matrophobia?
Yes.
All those women who wrote that they are afraid of being like their mother, right? That's true. I didn't make it up. And I was saying that people are being afraid of being like their mother. One of the times when it first came up in US feminism was during the, I believe maybe 70s liberation movement. And people didn't want to be like their mothers. I think they identified more with their fathers because the father is the one that had power and they saw their mothers as victims. That's where the matrophobia came from. And I don't know that African-American women, I didn't see them saying they didn't want to be like their mothers, you know? So I guess matrophobia is tied to European modernity, right? When as women get older, you think they're not attractive to men, it's all tied up with that. So there are no apologies to make for that. If that's how women are going to be represented, mothers are going to be represented, I don't support that. So that's why I was very critical of matrophobia. When it comes to feminism and decolonizing feminism, I've had various responses. One response is that, why do you want to decolonize feminism? That we can just leave it alone and if we find our own location, why even work with it? Because there has been so many critical ways of looking at feminism. I'm wondering what is left of it that we can work with. And for me, that's still a question. Then another thing, and I began to talk about that in my book, in the introduction to the book, African Women and Feminism. One of the things I said as I was trying to define exactly what feminism is that if we talk about feminism as females, and are females having agency and all that, I said the original feminism is African. So when we talk about original feminism, and I'm not the only one who said that, I think it was Philomena Steady who said first, the home of feminism, the original feminism is Africa. You remember that humanity is the gift of an African mother. Humanity is the gift of an African mother. And if you read my chapter on matripotency, there's no greater agency than having and raising children. And the first children were brought into being by an African mother. So if we think of feminism in terms of agency, original kind of agency, then Africa is the starting point. So I could think of that kind of feminism, but the other layers of it, we have to say, oh, it has to include race, it has to include intersectionality, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. I keep wondering what is left of it, you know? So I don't have one answer, but we have to think critically about these things. And if we think about it from where we are standing and we think about society, the world, spirituality on our own terms, then it has to be something different. For example, one of the reasons why I came up with the term matripotency is to also center the spiritual. For Yoruba, it's important to center the spiritual. But then when you just talk about feminism as feminism from the West, then you have to separate out the spiritual. And that for me is a problem. I can't say more than that, I'm sorry. But you also, of course, you know, these are complicated issues. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I will bring some questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will bring some questions from the chat, from the audience. Okay, so Tuila Ferreira is asking, you know, what? I will.
Everybody's frozen.
Is frozen? Are you listening?
Yes, but you were frozen.
Oh, sorry. Perhaps it's
my internet connection is unstable, but go on.
Okay. So, Tuila Ferreira asks, you know, in this academic Western world we live in, people tend to put everything in conceptual boxes. Personally, I never read you clearly stating yourself as a feminist or decolonial, but many scholars tend to do so after reading your texts. So I would be very glad if you could tell us yourself whether you consider yourself as so or not, feminist and decolonial.
Feminist, I just said that feminism for me is a very complicated subject because of the way it has evolved and the way it has been used against Africans. Okay, that's why I wrote White Woman's Burden. African women, the way in which African women have been represented in feminism has always been a problem. And so I am mindful of using a concept and carrying the baggage. Okay, number one. Number two, but it is also clear that the West, Europeans and Americans, have dominated the world and have created all sorts of pathologies in our culture, including many institutions that subordinate women that exist today, even though it hasn't totally erased who we are. Because it seems to me that we have to talk from many corners of our mouth. Because on the one hand, I cannot just take feminism from the West and plunk it down and say it's a solution. Because half of the time, feminism is also a problem. So that makes it difficult. However, as I just said, if we're talking about agency and the fact that Ana females must have agency, it starts with the African, because there's no greater agency than the birthing of humanity, which was the work of an African mother. And then another thing that I've also become so aware of lately is that we haven't done enough with the fact that humanity came out of Africa. They said humanity, Homo sapiens sapiens, have been in existence for about 300,000 years. And it was only 50,000 years ago that the Homo sapiens, some of them left Africa, only 50,000. And that's the only history we're focused on, 50,000. What about the 250,000 years of life in Africa, in which Africa domesticated crops, animals, And in short, Africans are the ones who have been living longest on planet Earth. And the more we learn from that, the more I find it difficult to just embrace Western modernity, which feminism is a part of. So that's my complicated answer, because I cannot just say, oh, I'm a feminist. One has to complicate and complicate and complicate it.
Okay. And
okay?
Yeah, people are also asking you to spell your name, please, because...
Não vai ter mais tradução simultânea, o povo está perguntando no chat.
Acho que está tendo. Não está tendo?
Não.
Não spell my name, what do you mean?
Então tá, não, porque o povo estava sinalizando ali, desculpa.
Depois, gente, lembrem que depois a gente vai...
Pronounce it?
Yeah, how your name is pronounced. People are asking also in the chat here.
Oyèrónkẹ Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí. And as I said, I find that Spanish-speaking people and Portuguese people do a better job of my name than Anglo, right? You can see every syllable. Oyèrónkẹ Oyèwùmí. Okay?
Okay, thank you. And we have 2 more questions, okay? Very quick.
Before you go into your question, in also thinking about the question of feminism and how to deploy it, I'm also thinking of one of the more interesting ways in which Professor Philomena's study characterized Anna female, that females are sociocentric, right? The category female and male, they are not one on the one hand and on the other hand. The category female, which is what I was also trying to capture with matripotency, is that category is not individual as such. Because when the Anna female enters the room, other things enter with her. The community enters. Children enters. So it's different from feminism, in which when you talk about equality, a man goes this way, a woman does the same, and it's more complicated than that. Okay, so your next question.
Ok, Suzana. Gente, só avisando, tá tendo tradução sim, tá? Tá tendo tradução. Vamos lá, Suzana.
Thank you very much, Professor Oyèwùmí. It's just a quick question. I know there's a lot of persons and people wanting to question. It's just about the relationship between your work and the colonial work. You quote from Aníbal Quijano. I know you quote Maldonado Torres. And I'm wondering, what is the place... The place of...
Tem que fechar o microfone, por favor. Todo mundo fechar o microfone.
The place of Maria Lugones' work, where she, with her paper, Gender and Coloniality for Us in Brazil, she brought your work at the center of this critique of the gender agenda from feminism. She showed the coloniality of gender using your work and using works of Native women in US. And I wonder, maybe it's my fault, why she's not, I don't see her mentioning on your work. Is that a problem, or what is this? Thank you very much again.
You don't see Maria Lugones mentioned in my work?
No. Sorry, because it's maybe my fault. I just want to know where I can find it.
Why should she be mentioned in my work? She's the one who is following me and borrowing from my work, number one. Then number two, when it comes to the Latin American decolonialists, as you pointed out, Susanna, when you read how Maria Lugones brought gender into decoloniality and all that, she used my work and the work of a Native American. And she was very clear about it, right? But do you know these days when people talk about gender as a colonial category, a lot of times they don't want to talk about me. They just want to give all the credit to Maria Lugones. And I think it's absolutely ridiculous because it was Maria Lugones who was using my work. And I have to say here today that one of the biggest problems that some of the decolonial theorists faced, Latin American decolonial theorists, is that they have, just like Maria Lugones did, they have to rely on evidence and data from indigenous societies. They don't have access to their own independent data, except if this Latin American is an indigenous Latin American. I can theorize Yorùbá society, I can theorize anything without reference to them. But they cannot. They have to reference the indigenous episteme. So you have different indigenous groups in the Americas. And if you want to talk about different episteme, Pachamama and all that, you have to go to the indigenous. If you don't go to the indigenous in the Americas, you have to go to the indigenous in Africa and all that. That's my understanding. So I don't see why I am the one who must talk about Maria Lugones. I don't understand what she brings to my work, okay? But I can see, and she has acknowledged what I brought to her work and her thinking. And I do know that before she died recently, right? She was also working with some indigenous groups in Mexico because she saw the need for it. So given that context then, I do not understand, Susanna, why you would ask me to be quoting Maria Lugones. For what? Thank you.
Can I make one last question? It's a brief one, and I think it's symbolic for us to finish. Someone in the audience is asking, how can Brazil and Africa work together to regain the habit of sovereignty you talked about in the end of your speech? So I think it's a good question for us to finish.
Yes, it's a good question for us to finish because we have to keep thinking about it and working towards it, because that's what we're doing now already, right? Dialoguing. And hopefully when the pandemic is gone, we will even be able to meet at conferences, at seminars, and work together. Okay? That's what I think. And the Orisha started us off.
Tatiana, uma última questão muito rápida.
Sim.
Perguntar para ela, por favor, qual é o... tem nessa palestra que ela faz sobre epistemologia... Alguém está traduzindo isso? É bem rápido, eu não vou me alongar, não vai demorar nem 10 minutos.
I can translate.
Tá. Na palestra sobre epistemologia pan-africana, que ela fez em Gana...
In the conference about Pan-African epistemology you did in Ghana,
ela falou sobre... Ela diz, nós terceirizamos o cérebro, nós só falamos de colonialismo.
You said, we only talk about colonialism, we terceirizamos, I don't know how to translate. Como, Luana, vai você.
Could you repeat, please, that last one?
Ela diz lá, nós terceirizamos o cérebro porque tudo se resume ao colonialismo.
And she says that we outsource our brain. And why does everything resumes or sums up on decolonialism?
Eu gostaria de saber qual é a sugestão, conselho, apontamento dela, o que ela acha que nós deveríamos, enquanto pessoas africanas em África ou em diáspora, estar discutindo para além do colonialismo.
We would like to know what else could be discussed for African people or African people in diaspora to beyond decolonialism and all.
You want to know what we need to be talking about apart from decoloniality or as part of...
O que ela quis dizer naquele momento? Qual era o caminho? Ela cita o Nkrumah, inclusive.
What you meant actually when you quote Nkrumah, when you say that we are outsourcing our brains. This is what she'd like to know, what you meant when you said that.
At the Pan-African Conference.
Yes.
Well, that a lot of us are not thinking for ourselves. And you feel this problem on the continent because it's as if they are waiting. They are waiting for the West to do this, to do that. And one of the most annoying ones today is like that when I hear the West, like they just finished this G7 meeting in England, and all they were talking about the poor countries, how we're going to give them vaccinations, how they don't have vaccinations, and we give them vaccines and all that. And one of my reactions, because I gave a speech shortly after that G7 meeting, I said that why is it that Africa is the richest continent in terms of resources, right? And these European leaders gather and start telling us that Africans are poor. Why are we poor? Because they are taking our resources. That is the point. And one of the effects of this is that too many of us are just waiting on the West. Too many of us are not thinking for ourselves. So one of the things I said as a result of this pandemic is that I came up with a term called pandemic epistemology. Pandemic epistemology. And I said that the colonial concerns fits in nicely with pandemic epistemology. The concept, pandemic epistemology, do we have a translator? The concept of
we have
pandemic epistemology speaks to a phenomena, speaks to something that I have noticed as a result of the COVID pandemic. The concept seeks to capture ideas and knowledge about the personal, the collective, the national, the global, that revealed themselves as a result of the pandemic. I'm saying that as a result of the COVID pandemic, we have come all over the world, globally, locally, and even personally, we have come to learn a lot of things about ourselves, about the world, about the globe. And one of the things that we have learned is that the Occident is not as capable as they pretend to be, right? Many African countries did better than European countries in keeping COVID at bay. Many did better than New York in keeping COVID at bay. Yet they did not want to give Africans any credit. They kept saying so many Africans will be falling down in the street. There'll be so many dead people. And even when Africans are not dying, they keep saying that. They are unwilling to give Africa credit for some of the steps they took. Because indeed, there were many African countries who took great steps in keeping COVID at bay. And even now, I mean, 2 days ago, I was still listening to BBC talking about the surge of the pandemic on the African continent. The African continent is still the one place where COVID hasn't totally overtaken the continent. Right now, in some countries in East Africa and Southern Africa, it's going up. But there are many West African countries in which COVID is not going up. So this is not about COVID, but the learnings, the knowledge we've gained. And I'm talking about pandemic epistemology because I am saying that some of the learning, some of the knowledge we're gaining, I hope that finally Africans, Latin Americans, we have to understand that we have to think and do for ourselves. Europe and America have exposed themselves as they are not gods. They are not people we must rely upon. They have failed us again and again. So I don't know why we keep relying on that. And it's on the basis of that we're saying that some of us seem to have outsourced our brain. We're not thinking for ourselves, right? We see in the West, for example, something as simple as language, ungendered language. They thought they had to go to Mars. Look, I gave a lecture the other day to a German audience. And I was making the joke that, oh, English is now an African language. And the woman said, don't say that. Yoruba language is a treasure that even the West wants to copy non-gendered language, right? So why are we on the continent throwing away our institutions, throwing our knowledge away and looking to the West? And so when I talk about the pandemic epistemology, I am saying that I hope that the different kinds of knowledge about ourselves, about the West, even at the level of the person. Personally, we also had pandemic epistemology because so many people didn't know they could ever get depressed. But during COVID, the isolation made them depressed, so they gained knowledge of themselves personally. So I'm saying that as bad as the COVID pandemic was, it was also a moment of knowledge. And my hope is that this knowledge will be brought to bear in terms of facing our challenges from wherever we are. And most importantly, it has exposed the West as not all-knowing. and that they have issues, serious issues, some of which we have overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I think these teachings about what we have to learn about the COVID crisis is very important and a very good way for us to finish this historical conference. So thank you very, very much. We are very, very excited to have you with us. Thank you. Gente, queria agradecer.
Thank you.
So we'll continue the exchange, conversation, collaboration
at the beginning.
Ancestors and Yorisha be with us. Ashe, Ashe, Dumari.
Ashe.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Gente, queria agradecer demais também a audiência, todo mundo que esteve com a gente, a organização do evento, a Bruna, a tradutora, a Carol, a Amanda e a Catiúcia Ribeiro, que estiveram na mesa aqui com a gente, a Suzana de Castro, a Caroline Marim, a Mary, da organização do evento. Acho que foi uma conferência realmente histórica. Muito obrigada. Nos encontramos na próxima.
Obrigada, Tatiana!
E tem continuação do evento hoje à noite.
As duas têm a mesa linda com a Paula o sobrenome me escapa, mas é sobre Glória Anzaldúa. Eu tenho medo do sobrenome, é meio... Um beijo.
E depois de noite também tem mais. Beijo.
E de noite tem mais ainda. Mesas e mesas.
Susana. Obrigada, obrigada.
Com a Paula, o sobrenome me escapa, mas é sobre Glória Anzaldúa. Eu tenho medo do sobrenome, é meio... Um beijo.